All right, Bindigan, welcome everyone. Wasazo and Unkwain Indigenous Nagik Nindodum, Michizakik Anishinaabe Kwayandao, Dushkin Zebing, Minwa, Alderville and Donjaba, Shaganashin and Inawism. So I just told you in Anishinaabe Moen that, my Anishinaabe Moen name, but also that I'm Otter Clan, a member of Alderville First Nation, but I say Dushkin Zebing, Minwa Alderville, so and Alderville, because I grew up just outside of London, Ontario. And my father is a third generation British white settler. And I'm here today as your moderator with these wonderful folks that are beside me here in the Forest City Gallery, which is located in Old East Village in London, Ontario, in the territory within the territories of the Anishinaabe, Lenape, and Haudenosaunee, as well as our relatives who there's much debate about what to call them. Some folks call them Attawandaron, some call them Cronachron, some call them Huron-Wyandotte, and that's a very complex thing that we are not here to talk about today, but we do acknowledge them and the fact that they are not here in these territories in the same capacity anymore. And we are surrounded. So we have some folks online, so welcome online, and we have some folks here in person. And we are surrounded by the words of some community members who have already contributed to the Towards Braiding exhibit, but also the words from the text Towards Braiding by Vanessa Andreotti, Elwood Jimmy, and Sharon Stein. And so this series, the speaker series and series of panels and events, and the exhibit, the interactive exhibit itself, came out of a series of conversations with the board of Forest City Gallery that I'm also on the board of. And we started talking about what does decolonizing look like for this space? What could it look like? Is it even possible? Because there's so much debate, right, about like what even is decolonizing institutions even possible. And this text, because it was produced out of a series of community conversations that Andreotti and Jimmy had, and the Mussagetti's Foundation, really speaks to a lot of the tensions that come up when we're trying to do this work in a colonial institution. And when you bring in Indigenous folks to help with that work, and kind of what can happen along the way, some of the missteps, some of the ways that we experience tension, but as actually Summer has told me many, many times, we have to consider how generative conflict can be. It can be a generative thing. And so the focus of today is Indigenous art as teacher. And before I get my guests to introduce themselves, I wanted to give some context as to why I brought everyone together under this sort of idea. And it's actually inspired by my colleague Beth here, who we've collaborated on a course called Connecting for Climate Change Action. And that course features the artwork of Urban Iskway. And Beth said to me one day about how there's different teachers in our course that are very explicit and implicit. So some of the teachers are explicit because you see my face, you see Beth's face, you see Serena's face. But some of the implicit teachers are Holly's art, the Urban Iskway's art themselves. And in consultation with people who have taken the course, a lot of people say what really made the course special for them and what made it really impactful was the Indigenous art and the Indigenous stories that were shared within it. So that got me thinking about when we bring Indigenous content into our courses and in other conversations, like with how Summer uses art in your course and Jennifer as well, about how people don't always think about art in certain disciplines or subjects as something you can bring in, but it adds immense value and perspective. So that is where this comes from. But before we totally get started too, I do also want to acknowledge that today is also like a heavy day for a lot of people. There's a couple protests that are happening today. So there's some folks that are protesting against it's like hard to articulate that are protesting against youth. I'm getting so emotional thinking about it. Trans and LGBTQ youth and their right to feel safe and secure at school. And then there's people who are counter protesting that. So shout out to them. And then also in Ottawa today, Chiefs of Ontario are rallying support because there's some huge federal policy implications about the Métis Nation of Ontario. It's really complicated. I don't even know how to articulate it, but there's just a lot going on. So I do want to acknowledge that and thank everyone that is here today for being here today. And if you stepped away from those other things, that's really meaningful. And we really appreciate you all being here. Last housekeeping, I think, is just this session is being recorded. So just so you guys know, I think, right? Yes, we agreed on that. Okay, just double checking. And then if you have a question, we'll have a question and answer at the end. So feel free to hang on to your questions till then. Folks online, just make sure you put it in the chat. And then Josh and Greg, thank you. Shout out to Public Humanities for live streaming this all, by the way, who are back there, and they'll help facilitate the questions. And then in person, like just, raise your hand and shout it out and I'll repeat it. So yeah, Chimigwach everyone for being here. And I'm just going to invite you all to introduce yourselves, maybe left to right. Perfect.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sarah May. Hi, everybody. My name is Beth Hundy. I'm a settler to Southwestern Ontario. On one side, I have 9 generations in Southwestern Ontario. The first person that I know of came from Germany in the 1770s and was in this area within a few years. And then actually the lineage has been in the same area for that time. And I'll explain a little bit why I mentioned that part in a moment. And on the other side, more recently, after World War II. I'm a settler and I'm a guest here, gratefully. And I teach environmental change and climate change. And I'm very used to thinking on long time scales. And it wasn't until a few years ago when I was working through a resource Sarah May shared with me that she made more than words. And I was working on the land acknowledgement specifically for my course. When I realized I was so used to putting my students in the context of, okay, we're so used to thinking on short time scales, but there are much longer time scales that I'm trying to get you thinking in. And I hadn't thought of my own lineage in that way and realized how short it really is that my family has been on these lands. And regarding why I'm here, I teach environmental change. I also teach Connecting for Climate Change Action, which is an open course that I've worked on. You heard a little bit about it, but with Sarah May, Serena Menzabel, and Katrina Moser, which is a course that we've released for basically adults, like full stop. So anybody can take the course, and it launched 2 days ago. So that's why I'm here as well, because we've been working a lot on what it means to incorporate art into that course and the impact that it's had.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Komarovsky. I'm a member of the Oneida Nation of the Thames. So on my mom's side, I'm Oneida, and on my dad's side, I also have settler roots. He's both British and Polish. And I grew up kind of moving all over Canada. So I came back to the London area just over 20 years ago. And I basically went to Western for a really long time. And now I'm an assistant professor at Toronto Metropolitan University in the philosophy department. So I'll be talking about how I use Indigenous art in teaching philosophy. So this year I'm teaching Intro to Indigenous Philosophy. So this is one of the primary courses in what I hope will end up being a minor next year in Indigenous thought. And next term, I'll be teaching a graduate course on Indigenous eco-criticism as well.
Chimigwech. Abujo, New Benastic Indigenous Cause, Mang and Dodem. Wilkadam Minua, Ajodan, Donjaba, Nishnabikwe, Minua, Borwami Queenida. Nimishomisi Banonji, Dashkan Zibing. Abchigo, Nimigwach Vandam Nungum. Minua Abchigo, Minuandam Nungum. My Anishinaabe name is Neo Benasik. I'm from Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. I'm Loon Clan, and I'm also Potawatomi. My Potawatomi ancestors came to this territory to seek refuge in the 1830s during the Indian Removal Act in the United States. And so I belong to renegade ancestors who never did what they were told and just followed their hearts. So I also, I guess, I teach at the Anishinaabeg Education Institute. Their Muncie campus is located about a half an hour outside of the city. In the past 4 years, I've been teaching art and Indigenous expression. Last year, I had a really exciting course with my students called Music as Agent of Change, which was pretty awesome. I'm also a consultant, storyteller, playwright. I've assisted in curating a couple of exhibits in the past few years as well. And I also had my own exhibit here last year. So it's really nice to be invited back and to speak about things that I'm really passionate about, things that I love. And teaching students, Indigenous students, in my program has actually taught me probably as much as I have been a part of their learning. And so it goes both ways, which, you know, I think we have on our wall in the back here the word reciprocity. And that's, to me, what Indigenous learning and sharing is about.
Teeny what? So as you can see, we have some pretty amazing folks to hear from today. And I also probably should mention my day job. I'm also the curriculum pedagogy advisor at the Office of Indigenous Initiatives. And so also, you know, thanks to OII for helping make this happen as well. And before we get into an overview of just some of the ways that you each bring in art as teacher, I also have been thinking about something that somebody had said to me recently, that they heard from someone else about how, you know, this exhibit sounds less like art and more like policy. And it really got me like thinking about that, like what those intersections between art and policy and education. And I just think about, you probably can't see it online, but there's a wall here that says, what do you understand about treaties and treaty responsibilities? And there's an image that my coworker Paula drew of the 2-row wampum belt and the dish with 1 spoon wampum belt. And I want to bring those ideas into this conversation. And because, you know, I acknowledge the nations at the beginning that are from these that belong to these territories. And we have these beautiful pieces of artwork, which are the wampum that carry so many stories, but also teach us about how to engage with one another and our relationships with one another. And that is in many ways policy that these wampum belts carry, that we call policy today in this colonial sort of understanding of it. And so just really thinking about how much dish with 1 spoon, for example, in this territory, the dish represents, you know, the Great Lakes Basin, the Great Lakes area, and the land essentially. And we all eat from the dish with the same spoon, and how Elder Marianne Kichigo shared at the opening the teachings around that, about how, you know, we always have to leave the spoon clean, and we always have to take care of the dish and make sure everything is taken care of. And we have to leave enough for the next ones. The next one's coming. And all that is encoded in those images, and then it's the stories around them that keep it going, and that is art. And you know, Anishinaabe folks and Indigenous folks, we have so much in our culture around creating together and sharing. And so I just think it's really important to think about how you know, art isn't just this like picture on a wall in a gallery. It's all around us. Like, creation carries so much beauty that inspires us. When we create art, we use materials that come from the land. We use ideas that come from the land inspiration. And so those are just some of the context that I'm throwing out there for this conversation. So each of you mentioned the capacities in which you teach, or some of the capacities in which you teach, because I know, like Jennifer, you're a mother, so that's a whole other lessons that you teach. But maybe starting with Summer and coming back this way, can you give an example of some of the ways, or one of the ways that you bring art in as a teacher?
I think, yeah, that's pretty much everything about my role as an educator for the Anishinaabe Education Institute. But I think back to something that gave me a lot of inspiration a few years ago. So I've been teaching online since the pandemic. But before that, I was driving to the Muncie campus to teach. And so it was this really beautiful fall day. And I was looking at just all of the colors around me, the sumac. I was looking at, the goldenrod, the colors on the trees. Everything was just coming alive as I was driving. And I just became very aware of the ecosystem around us, and how much bounty and beauty and abundance is in our communities. And I thought of a painting by Christy Belcourt called The Wisdom of the Universe. And Chippewas of the Thames, also was the site of the former Mount Elgin Residential School. And so as I was driving along the road into Muncie, I was thinking of these things, of the wisdom of the universe. And I was thinking of, the site of the residential school and the things that were taken from us in residential school, that were taken from our families and our grandparents and our relatives who attended the school. And so I was thinking about, what am I going to talk about in class today? Because those two ideas were really sort of fresh in my mind. And so I used the painting Wisdom of the Universe, which was commissioned by the Art Gallery of Ontario, for Christy. And so it has like over 220 species that were are extinct, endangered, nearly extinct, just in southwestern Ontario alone. But what I also seen in that painting was the abundance that is around us. And my thought was, as Indigenous people, even before going into these colonial institutions and having been ripped of so many things, I thought of the perspective that as much as there is abundance outside of us, we also have that abundance within us. And the sense of loss that we feel because of residential school is the loss of that sense of worth, that loss of sense of place, that sense of being capable. And I think when I looked at the piece by Christy Belcourt, and I, wanting to address, what has been lost, but what actually is. And what is that, we still have within us that wisdom of the universe. We still have without us, even in our communities, this beauty of the natural surroundings. And so it was a real gift that day. And then going forward, I asked my students to journal on wisdom of the universe at the beginning of the term for each of my classes. But that was my thought going forward. And I thought, this is something that's really, for me, it resonates. And it's something that we can look at Indigenous art, and we can look at the commissions, and we can look also at what we're presented with in Indigenous art. is a reflection of ourselves, and I really wanted to share that with my students.
So my experience is a little bit different. So I teach philosophy at Toronto Metropolitan. So there's actually a much smaller Indigenous student body there. So most of the students I'm teaching are settlers from various places. Yeah, so I begin my class. I've taught this class the last 2 years at Toronto Metropolitan now. So Intro to Indigenous Philosophy, I spend pretty much the first 2 weeks kind of showing the students how Indigenous storytelling is Indigenous philosophy. So a lot of you guys probably know, if you teach in any capacity, how hard it is to get students to do any readings for the very first week of classes, a week's going on, all that kind of stuff. So instead of having them read a version of the creation story, what I do is start off by having them listen to January Rogers' Sky Woman Falling. So this is like a spoken word poem set to music. And I think it's approximately 5 or 6 minutes long. And we sit there and listen to it together. And this gives them kind of an idea of Sky Woman's journey from Sky World down to the back of the turtle. So, a small part of the creation story, but it gives them an idea of what I'm talking about. In addition to that, I also show them a lot of artwork by various Indigenous artists depicting Sky Woman. So we talk about those, go all the way back usually to like Ernest Smith's representation, which I really like because it includes Sky World. You see the longhouses up there. And we talk about, the elements that are really common to all of these things. So they're really learning what the creation story is through Indigenous art. And I think that, talking about storytelling as philosophy itself is really kind of getting to the heart of Indigenous art and Indigenous creation is Indigenous philosophy. And it's filled with philosophy and all of our values, Summer just brought up reciprocity earlier. That's one of the major things we talk about. So we kind of go through why the creation story is so important and why I'm beginning the class with this. And reciprocity and all the values that come out of it is one of the major things that we talk about. So yeah, we spend approximately the first 2 weeks talking about just why storytelling is philosophy, because this is totally different from a Western philosophical point of view. So my other class that I'm teaching right now, which I was just telling you about earlier, I'm teaching like Plato and Aristotle, all the Germans. And I'm not using art to teach that, or kind of like doing like old school Western philosophy, right? So teaching students who are used to this kind of learning, Indigenous philosophy, I think is totally different. And I think when I see them learning this, and no matter what their background is, I think that they really get inspired by it and they have a lot of stuff to say. And, we go through a lot of stuff about storytelling. So I usually go back to Daniel Heath Justice and why Indigenous literatures matter. And he asks several questions about story, like things that we learn from storytelling in his text. So, how do we learn to be human? How do we learn to be good ancestors? How do we learn to be good relatives? These kind of questions. And, this is kind of like at the end of the 2 weeks, at the end of my second lecture, and my students are like, kind of blown away. They're like, these are the exact same questions that we're thinking through Western philosophy, what we're thinking about this in terms of storytelling. So yeah, it's kind of like a major revelation for them, right? So that's all I have to say.
I work in the Department of Geography and Environment, and one of the things that I want to share about how we've been using art, and that's been really incredible experience for us, I guess I'll speak for you a little bit too, is that we've been actually communicating some of the principles and the stories within our course by collaborating with artist Holly Pichette, who's Mushkego Cree and lives in London. And in some cases, this is her helping us to portray stories. Reciprocity has come up a few times. So one of the examples is her beautiful image of corn, beans, and squash. And then students have some art to help that stay with them. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the feedback we've got about how the art helps them to remember those stories and also to focus on the story and maybe not their note taking and just listen. And that's one of the things that we talk about as well. But I think the art really helps to do that. I am trained as a scientist, and one of the other things that we do and that I've really learned through this process is the storytelling that's in science. So I spent countless hours looking at the documents put out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's my area of research. And some of these figures, I've seen 6 iterations of them that show, for example, the future possible pathways that we can take as all kin on Earth, human and non-human. And I've seen this so many times, and we started talking about what it's trying to portray, and also started realizing a little bit what it's missing, which is that we actually have agency and choice in terms of the pathways that we can possibly take. So with Holly, we re-envisioned what this could look like. And for me, this is one of the most profound moments in terms of what we created, even though I think there are some other art that she's created that's even more beautiful. But we re-envisioned this graph into a canoe that has choice, that has people in the canoe, and they have a choice to make, and they have agency. They're the ones paddling. And seeing these pathways, some are named, some are not, as streams. And that the paddling may not be easy, but actually these are all made up of choices that we make each time that we paddle. And so that was a way that really got me thinking about the messages that we've been trying to share in science, and what some of that is missing in terms of seeing these as like pathways that we are subject to versus us being part of the climate, which is a big part of our course, that we've always been part of the climate. So that's been a beautiful experience. And for folks that are here, we put a poster up in the hallway on the way out. You can check some of Holly's art in the course. But that's been a big way that we've used it. And we've been so grateful to be able to collaborate actually in the creation of some art for the course. We also use Wisdom of the Universe by Christy Belcourt, and I brought little cards of it here, which is kind of funny because it's actually a 3-meter piece. So seeing it in this size doesn't quite give you an idea of the expanse of it. But we get students thinking about a quote that she has in her artist statement, which is, what would it look like if we placed the rights of Mother Earth before the rights to Mother Earth? And it's amazing what students from all disciplines, this course is taught at Western for students from any discipline. When we ask them, what could that actually look like in your community if we were to act in that way as society? So getting students to think in a different way, and getting students from all disciplines who may be very focused the way I had been trained as well, to be really looking at graphs and thinking more about what would we like to see in the future. And the final one I just want to mention is giving students the opportunity, again, they're from all disciplines, to express their reflections that they have in our course in an open-ended way. So some do write their feelings, but I think even doing that is a form of art compared to what they're often asked to do in the university setting, to think creatively or to communicate themselves honestly about what they're feeling as they work through the course. But also some of them choose to include their own art or art that they resonate with when they're reflecting on what they're learning. Because learning about climate change, it's been taught for so long as a science, but science is never going to be the thing that on its own would get us to where we're going. So then to teach students only in the science way is missing the fact that we actually need to engage our hearts and our morals and our connections for the climate future that they envision.
So many thoughts are going through my head right now. And just being mindful of the next question I'm thinking of, but I'm thinking of that the wisdom of the universe. So Chrissy Belcourt's and how you mentioned, Summer, that there's hundreds of species depicted in that. And then I'm also thinking about the creation story and how it really is about land and like where where Sky Woman like physically landed, and then the land that was created that became our home and the home of all of the of animals and species that helped build it. So like through the that's the you offer the Haudenosaunee creation story, and I know the Anishinaabe creation story, where um, I guess as famously imagined by Leanne Simpson, dance where creation was danced in, like we danced creation into happening. And I don't know if that's a characteristic in that one as well. We're, you know, if you're from the same land, chances are your creation stories are going to overlap, you know. And so just thinking about that dance as expression, as art, as movement, dancing creation into being, dancing land into occurring on the turtle's back as part of that story. And then also another feature of the climate change course too is asking us like, you know, what is your relationship to land, but also what can we learn from the land? What can we learn from the relationships that exist on the land and our relationships to each other? And so all of these things to me are so like woven in together, and then trying to articulate that out, right? Like having this panel so we can like try to talk about it and like really get that out there, because we talk all the time about Indigenous pedagogy and bringing Indigenous pedagogy and Indigenous ways of knowing and being into the classroom, but it's like it's all out there. It's all right there. And so then we have folks like Urban Iskway, like Holly Pochette, who are trying to illustrate those, because we can't always take the students out to a field where corn, bean, and squash are growing, but we want to, because they can see how the corn grows straight and tall, and the beans use the support of that sister to climb up, and then the squash shades the bottom and kind of keeps the pests away, and how just profound that teaching is, and how we like constantly bring it alive again and again through story, through art, and through all of these things. And so it's really just about trying to get folks to think about how bringing in Indigenous perspectives into the classroom for your students doesn't have to necessarily look like you telling them like what, like this is this. It can be a, you know, like showing them Indigenous art and like allowing them in true Indigenous pedagogical tradition to interpret meaning from that with, yes, what they know and their experiences, but relate to it and build a relationship to that artwork, or to whatever that story in their own way, because you know we tell our stories, and it's kind of like, you know, some stories you hear from an elder and you're kind of at the end, you're just like, the heck was the point of that? Like, I don't know. But then like 10 years later, you're sitting and doing something and you're like, oh, I get it. Right. So it's like, that's kind of, you know, where it is. So, you know, some students might go through the climate change course and be like, I don't care about this art, you know, that kind of thing. And then maybe years later, they're like, what the heck? Right. So you guys each kind of touched on it a little bit about like why you chose each of the things that you choose. But I'm thinking too about, you know, even from your positionality, Beth, about like ethically and respectfully as a non-Indigenous person bringing that into the classroom. So like what kind of factors and things do you guys consider when you're bringing these things into the classroom, and you've helped facilitate the learning? And I don't know if you want to, like, I don't want to put, you know, each of you on the spot, or, you know, whoever wants to answer first, I guess. Yeah.
I don't mind starting because you kind of called me a little bit. But one of the things I've been really thinking about is how much I appreciate artist statements. And I know that I'm an amateur appreciator of art, and I know that at times the art is just to speak for itself, but I have appreciated when there is an artist statement that I can point students to, and maybe they think on their own first about what they're taking from it, but I love to be able to share an artist statement after so they can see what the artist had in mind, especially because I do work with students who in a lot of cases don't have as much experience with art. I the very first time that I can think of that I used Indigenous art in my class is when I realized I was remiss to not be doing a very specific land acknowledgement for my environmental change course. And I went out on Twitter and I asked, does anybody have any ideas for art that I could use kind of for students to, I don't know, maybe not be looking at me, but also to have something to kind of focus their minds when I'm talking about something that's really hard to share and heartfelt. And that's when I met Mike Sywink, who's in the room. He's like, just paid attention again. And he had really generously shared art that he created called Responsibility and talked a little bit about what it meant as well. And again, I was able to share this art, and I see a difference in how students focus when you are sharing from the heart and when they can look at something that's from the heart. I didn't ask them that, but I do feel like I can see that energy when they're just focused and able to think and have their pens down and paying attention. So that's helped me to be able to point to the words of Indigenous people about their own art. So that's kind of I guess that's one way that I've felt like, even if I, as an adjunct professor, couldn't hire Mike to come and speak about his art, I know that his own words are there and that I could say that this was a generous gift to share that art with our class.
Have any other?
Yeah, I mean, I draw on art from quite a few sources, from popular stuff, from like Shelley Nero, her exhibit in the Canadian History Museum, well-known pieces from Ernest Smith, stuff like that. So, I mean, just to kind of like, I just want to find things that illustrate what I'm talking about, but I also like to get things from artists that I know or use things in the classroom. So from January Rogers' Sky Woman Falling, I got her permission to use this and play it for my students in that class every term. I've used pieces of art to show the students, what I want them to understand from practicing artists that I know, such as my sister Rowan Red Sky, who's an artist in Toronto. Yeah, things like that. I like that you brought up dancing just a second ago. So I actually do talk about that. So like the women's shuffle dance. So I'll bring up videos of dancing from YouTube and show the students. And I kind of like, when I'm teaching, I'm usually kind of pacing back and forth and really like animated. And I'll start like shuffle dancing as we're talking about it and kind of like going through this part of the story again, where we talk about, how this earth is being packed down and really trying to, make them understand how important this is. So the art that I'm using really ties into the philosophies that I want them to understand.
My experience. So I was invited to be an instructor at AI a number of years ago, and I was really enticed because the director at the time said, "We're trying to decolonize our classrooms. We want you to decolonize your classroom as much as possible, and how in ways that you see that it can be more indigenized, decolonized." And so I was really excited at that. I was like, oh my God, I can't wait to do this. I'll throw the textbook out the window, which I did. And my students weren't ready. And so it was like a really humbling experience for me as an instructor, because, we're operating on the assumption that because we're Indigenous and we're teaching Indigenous students, that our experiences and our understanding of decolonizing and indigenizing is the same, but it's not. And so I kind of freaked them out because we weren't doing something expected, like going by the textbook. And so, in that year, when I shared earlier that I learned as much from my students as I'm sharing with them, that idea of reciprocity. So I had a lot of learning that year as a first-time instructor to Indigenous students. not just learning about art for the first time, but also in how to teach that and communicate that with students. And we then kind of like, I dialed it back a lot, and then started teaching art, also from the perspective of identity building, recognizing that many of my students who came to the program are from the Tri-Res Chippewa-Munsee Oneida territory and the local First Nations communities outside of London, Middlesex. So what I did was I had to go back to like my very beginnings as Anishinaabe, as somebody who practices art, who also practices storytelling, and a lot of people in my family are artists and creative folks. So my dad is a professional musician, my mom is a visual artist. I have cousins who are filmmakers and they're in theater, and I'm myself also doing theater. So I thought, when did this all begin and how do I teach this? How do I teach this to somebody else who might not have had the privilege that I did growing up, really strongly rooted in my identity, strongly rooted in creative practices. And I had to think about what art gives me that I can share. And it was storytelling, and beginning that journey with my students, sharing stories and kind of easing back into this idea of what does a decolonized classroom look like? What does an Indigenous classroom look like, especially at the post-secondary level? And so I began focusing more on woodlands art and building identity through a sense of our artistic practices here in this territory. And I found that I was able to connect more with my students when I saw it as using art to help them with a more grounded sense of their identities, and also to celebrate the artistic traditions of our peoples in this area, and also what's happening in contemporary art. So I thought, that was a really great way to balance it. But again, as instructors, I think there's a very colonial sense that because we are the teachers, that there's a hierarchy. And an Indigenous perspective is that we are sharing, we're equal to our students. I taught students who were much older than myself. And as a Indigenous person, as an Anishinaabe, we're always taught that that people who are older than us are our elders. We respect their experiences, we respect their knowledge and those gifts that they carry. So oftentimes, if you're coming at teaching from an Indigenous perspective and an Indigenous worldview, those are things like having things done in a circle, starting every morning with a smudge and sharing circle, starting things with, helping your students to feel like we're all here to learn and share together. And that is, to me, an Indigenous classroom. But before that, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to, excuse my language, decolonize the shit out of this classroom. Okay, like that. So yeah, that was my humble pie. And it's been a real journey, and I really appreciate my students so much. And I appreciate the opportunity to share in their decolonizing journey and my own decolonizing journey as an instructor. So yeah.
It is really challenging in that, as you were talking, Summer, you just reminded me of when I was teaching last semester. And then, I kind of did say at the beginning, I'm taking a storytelling approach where I'm going to share all kinds of things. Like the issue is, or the course was contemporary Indigenous issues. And so I literally started out with storytelling. What are the stories you think you know about Indigenous people? How have they shaped your perspectives of Indigenous people? Why are you taking this course? What do you think you're going to get out of it? And then kind of said when it comes to storytelling, and contemporary Indigenous issues, or contemporary colonial issues is what I would rather call it. How are you? So you're thinking about that, and it's a half credit course, and it's only 12 weeks, and you've had not a whole lot of pre-work or pre-learning. Like students just now that are graduating high school, maybe are getting a little bit more education around like truth and reconciliation in residential schools since 2015 and the calls to action being released, but we're only maybe just slightly starting to seeing them enter, first year university with maybe at least when you say, put up your hand if you know about residential schools, maybe like this year's class might but then you have international students and folks that have no idea, right? And so they have so little foundation, and then here I am trying to explain like history of colonization, 100 and almost six, or well, more than 100, about 500 years of colonization, and and then also being like, I'm going to share a whole bunch of stories with you, and if something resonates with you, I encourage you to go look it up, go research it more if you thought this artist or this story was, interesting. And then by the end of the course, you get your feedback, your course feedback. And, it wasn't like a lot, there was lots of positive, but there were quite a few students who said, the professor seemed to like ramble a lot, and I didn't know what the point and there's people in this room who are like, oh well, I'm not surprised by that, but it's kind of like just this sort of way of being like, what you take from it is what you take from it and what you understand with it, and I'm just a facilitator of your learning experience. I can't make you walk away with any understanding. This is like me being like, I don't know, interact with pieces of my brain here and see what happens, this exhibit. And so, yeah, just thinking about those things and how, how scary it is for non-Indigenous educators too, who are trying to bring these things into the classroom, and it's not their positionality, and then it doesn't go well, right? And then that is like, okay, well, I give up then. I tried this Indigenous pedagogy thing, it's not working out. And it must be me because I'm not Indigenous, or it must be this, but it's because our students are used to learning a certain way. They've spent their entire public school and high school years learning in a specific way. They might have had a couple teachers who really challenged that or thought out of the box, or maybe some programs that they had access to through FMMI stuff, or like on the land learning. But that's the reality of it. So I guess like I'm just thinking like, don't get, listen to somewhere there, don't give up. It is this work is highly experimental and we don't know, like this space behind here, it says this space is for dreaming. I had someone in a workshop ask me once, like, but like, what's the goal here? Decolonizing, like, what's the point? And I'm like, in that moment, my learning, I wish I had asked that person and said, well, what do you think the point is? That's a good, what is that Socratic method where you're like, yeah, where you're like, oh, what do you think? Didn't do that. Well, the hindsight is 2020. But I said, I think it'll look like the point is different for everybody. Like, I think different people are going to have their own idea. But I think the point is like equality and, anti-oppression for all. I don't know. I think that's kind of the point we're trying to get to. But it is really challenging in that regard, and thinking about how to prepare your students to engage respectfully and ethically with Indigenous perspectives and with Indigenous art and with Indigenous experiences in this way. And that is also a whole other piece of it. And so I'm just like mindful of time, and I like we have quite a lot of time, but also like people's attention spans, and they're and like you want to stand up and shake things off. But I'm just thinking in this last little bit, if you could maybe share any of your own profound learning moments you've had, or maybe perhaps some of the experiences of students that you've heard like come back to you when they've like engaged with this art, because I think it might help everyone who's listening to see what those impacts are of the things that we or you've created.
I can start.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is exactly the direction you want me to go in, but when I start the first 2 weeks of my course and we're talking about storytelling, I bring up Daniel Heath Justice's idea of good storytelling and bad storytelling. So good storytelling being the stories we tell about ourselves, whether they're, sad, good, bad, whatever. And bad storytelling in this sense is stories told about Indigenous people from the outside. So by settlers, whether it's, nefarious or not, stories that are not good about us. So we do look, of course, at a ton of Indigenous storytelling. So we're looking at different versions of the creation story through art, other means. We look at Basil Johnson's stories, things like that. But I also bring up some examples of bad storytelling. So I think it's really important in a classroom, which is mostly not Indigenous students, to undo those kind of Canadian, common knowledge about Indigenous people. So on the first day, I bring up a piece that I found in the 2020 Verso Book of Feminism. And if you don't know what Verso is, they're kind of a left-wing publisher, publish a lot of Marx, stuff like that. So this Verso book came out in 2020, so only 3 years ago. The very first page is an Indigenous story, or purported to be an Indigenous story. It uses a lot of words that I won't repeat here. It's from an unknown time, or like date unknown. There's no storyteller given. It's just from, I think it's the Northern Paiute people. And looking into this version of the story was actually from a settler academic's own book of poetry. So he took this, and he is the one who actually added in the words like the C word, you know what I mean? Other negative words for Indigenous women, stuff like that. So we look at it, and I have my students go through it with me and, basically pick it apart. Talk about, the trope of like the timeless Indian. Like, why is there not a date given for when this story was told, right? Why is there not a storyteller given? And, pick apart the language as well. And then just this past week, we actually, I brought up 2 poems by Duncan Campbell Scott. So one of them was the Onondaga Madonna, and the other was the Forsaken. And I found it was really interesting because, of course, I brought this up. We read the first poem together, and we started, of course, like critiquing it. And when I told them who Duncan Campbell Scott was, I think like this all started to make sense. So I went into a whole thing about, he was this Canadian bureaucrat. He came to be like the head of Indian Affairs. He was the one who legislated how Indigenous children having to go to residential schools. He made it mandatory. Just like gave the whole history of who he was, and essentially, framed his work as, political propaganda in a sense, right? And then we looked at the next poem, The Forsaken, which has a lot of similar themes. And I did get some pushback from a few students, not all of them. So comments like the woman in the poem was being depicted in a good way. And I think that this is important, even though it's really sad. And even like Justice in his work talks about how these kind of stereotypes come out in class from students who either grew up with them, or maybe they're from another country and they heard them before coming to North America. And so things like that this was a good depiction. And I was like, well, this is actually a stereotype of what we would call the noble savage, right? And kind of like educating on them on this. And I'm like, this is not a true story about something that actually happened. This is made up to meet like a certain end, right? In depicting Indigenous people in a certain way by somebody who wanted to make us disappear from this land, right? Whose end goal was to make that happen. And that's why he depicts us as a doomed and dying race. So I found it, and you know, when I did get a little bit of like negative pushback from it was only a couple of students, like everyone else's hands shut up. All the other students, they wanted to like push back against it. And so I said what I had to say, but I also let them, you know, talk amongst, we like have like a really collegiate environment in my classroom. And yeah, like all the students, it's like a really good learning experience, I think. And they really like see, okay, this is the same dude who was sending kids to residential schools, who's writing like foundational Canadian literature, and there's politics behind it, right? So, I mean, and then comparing that to actual Indigenous stories and actual Indigenous literature, I think then they see like the values of reciprocity and, you know, caring about our relatives and ancestors and stuff like that come out, right?
You made me think of so many things there, and I like totally didn't even know Duncan Campbell Scott was like a poet too, or did anything like that.
He's Confederate, one of the Confederate poets.
Yeah, but very much so. It's like thinking about that role, like how storytelling is so powerful because it really does shape the world around us and shape how people think. And really, truly, I wish I could remember this person's name. I was at a conference like a couple years ago and sat in on her session, and she was, I think, an Iraqi scholar who was talking about how when India was being colonized by Great Britain, the English subject, the subject of English as a like English as a subject in schools, came out of that education system because the British were like, if we tell them our stories, they'll be like us. They'll like, you know, pick up the morals and the things. So we're gonna teach them British stories and British literature and those kinds of things as a subject so that they like soak it up. And, you know, and I think that that's the flip side is so true. It's like, you know, if I tell folks all the time, if you sit and you listen to Indigenous folks and you hear our stories, and it makes me think of Lee Miracle. She has this article called The Scent of Burning Cedar, and they talk about sitting around this kitchen table, and they all are talking about what they want for the future and the things that they want to do. And you know, and one Lee Miracle's like, you know, she's deceased now, rest in peace, but she says, I'm going to tell the old stories, and I'm going to tell them in English, so that people, you know, can hear them. But she's going to like, I'm going to tell them like the old folks tell them. And then someone in the room's like, won't that make some people just like us? She's like, yeah. And they're like, well, then what would be the point of being, you know, any different, or, you know, Indigenous and that kind of thing. And there's, you know, a conversation around this part too, but she goes, well, there wouldn't be any point at all. And it's just kind of interesting how this person's like, you know, saying like, well, if you give, you know, and that's part of it too for Indigenous folks, because of the impact of colonization, is we are really safeguarded about our art and our stories, because people do take them and they interpret them in different ways, and they appropriate them and they use them in these ways for their own self-gain or to further oppress us at times. And so it's really challenging. And then that's a tricky thing to navigate in the classroom too, because you have folks that are coming to terms with, wow, all these stories and understandings I had up until this point aren't maybe the truth, or aren't a truth, that like there are other truths that exist out there. And then navigating that with your students is quite complex, because they're really coming to terms with like, wait a second, you mean everything I've been told since I was little is like, you know, and you kind of radicalize it's a little bit, but yeah. But in terms of the original question, I should go back to, did you want to share any key learnings that students have shared with you, or any profound learning from art that you didn't have a chance to share yet?
We did, so again, you know, every year I have a different group of students, and I think, you know, for me, like we're talking about, you know, things like indigenizing our classroom. I work with Indigenous students. What does that look like? It's recognizing and meeting my students where they're at. And The other part, earlier last year, I had a group of students who were going through the social work stream at AEI, and one of my students said, why are we studying art? What has art got to do with, you know, professional practice? Like, once we graduate, what are we going to do with this? And so then I was like, you know, do you ever have, and maybe it's you, but do you ever have like that relative or that friend on Facebook or social media who posts song lyrics, and you have to try and figure out what's going on with that person? And I was like, you know, it's when we're out and we're working professionally in the world, and you know, for those students who were going on to be, you know, community workers and counselors and community helpers, I was like, we need to be able to, you know, use art, use music, use, um, you know, films, you know, expanding the idea of what is art beyond just visual art, to help reach our clients, reach our community participants and our relatives. And so we did like this exercise. We watched an interview with Buffy St. Marie on CBCQ, where she talked about the 5 songs that changed her life. And so I got my students to watch the interview with Buffy St. Marie, and then, you know, take their time to do a presentation in class about the 5 songs that changed their life. And it was really awesome, because it was also a really vulnerable moment for a lot of my students, to be able to share how music had impacted them. And I was like, you know, kind of trying to set the stage for them. I was like, okay, you know, remember a time when you listened to music on your bedroom floor and you had your headphones on, and or you're driving in a car with like your best friend, and you have a playlist and you just want them to listen to your playlist because you think that they're going to understand you better. And so I'm like, take this time, you know, when you're developing your presentations, to really think about what those 5 songs on your playlist are. And we had fun with that. And it was, I think, the first time that a lot of my students had the opportunity to be vulnerable in our class. And then going back to storytelling, one of the things that was eye-opening to me, was we did theater, and we did a couple of play readings. We did the Res Sisters. We learned about Thompson Highway. We also did a new play, or newish play, Women of the Fur Trade. And then my students, we did theater games. We did, you know, a lot of, I think, team building in our group. And I thought, you know, what's this going to turn out like? I was, you know, was experimenting. But again, it was like, for me, I have a love of theater, and sharing that with my students, but also asking my students to participate and to be vulnerable. And I think, you know, when you're teaching art, when you're talking about art, when you're experiencing art, or if you are, you know, doing art yourself, you do need to be vulnerable. And because it's in those vulnerable moments where we really learn from each other. And again, that brings me back to, you know, what my classroom is, and what I hope to create in that space, whether it's online or whether it's in person, is a safe space for learning and sharing and being vulnerable. And you know, even when their instructor you know, has this big assumption that we're all on the same page, and, you know, like, really having that humility to learn with your students, rather than putting yourself like up at the top. You're like, I know everything, you know, I don't know everything. And being comfortable sharing that with them. I think for me, the biggest, I think my big breakthrough moment with my students, and was theater and it was music, even though I've taught them visual art in the past. Many of you might have online classrooms and your students have their screens off. And so you're just talking to like a blank square. And so when we did theater and we did music, people turned their screens on and they were excited and they wanted to share and they wanted to learn and they wanted people to know like the playlist of their life. They wanted to be silly and do theater. And I have to say that like teaching Indigenous students theater and drama also comes from like understanding that not a lot of our young people, not a lot of our adults have experienced theater, have ever read a play, have ever done theater games. And so I, again, I felt really lucky in my life that at a really young age, I was introduced to Debauchmatic Theater because of their traveling around with the Red Sisters. So I saw the Red Sisters performed when I was like maybe 10 or 11. And so I wanted to share that with my students. And, it was, I think for me, the biggest reward was, to see them, just visually like light up and they were committed to it. And, they shared with me afterwards that they really loved learning about theater. They really loved the opportunity to share music. And then for them to go on and, some of them graduated this past year to include learning and sharing about art in their own community practice. So that was a big win for me as an instructor.
Awesome. It brings us together. It really does. I loved what you said about the vulnerability too.
I resonated a lot with what Summer was talking about too, with learners being teachers and the teachers learning a lot. I certainly have learned so much through all of my teaching experiences, but especially with this collaborative effort we had on Connecting for Climate Change Action. And at the very beginning, Sarah May was mentioning how we were talking about land as teacher and art as teacher, and then the artist as teacher. And what folks wouldn't know, because we haven't chatted about, is that there's so many more people on our team. We have these undergraduate students who bring Holly's art to life and animate it. And they learn to be respectful of that art, which is a lot different than working with clip art and stock art that you see. And I talked to one of our artists, Bridget Koza, who's also here, yesterday, like gave her tons of warning, and had a really brief conversation about kind of what you learn by engaging with the art. And I don't know if you know this, Bridget, but we talk about you and your team as teachers too, because they have a way of turning art and also some of the other imagery into the storytelling that we're sharing. They put the visuals to that. We see people like Bridget as teacher, but then I also learned what Bridget learned from that process of being tasked with animating some of this art. And so one of the things that Bridget talked about is, so we talk a lot about interconnectedness. So I already talked about how we are not separate from the climate, but also the rocks are not separate from the climate. The entire biosphere, the atmosphere, all of these things are connected. And so you can probably all envision like a grade 4 textbook that has the words and the lines that link these things together. And you can imagine animating that too, but that's not what we did. And so Bridget talked about all the work that she put into taking Holly's art about our interconnectedness, which has no arrows, really no words, but shows that feature and how that's going to stick with her. And when she thinks about the interconnectedness, those are the visuals that come to mind. And also just, I'm sharing, you shared it with me knowing I might share it. So I'm also just going to share that Bridget said that aside from the questions I asked her, working on the course overall had a big impact on her personal artwork because she's also an artist, and made her feel more confident in discussing world issues in her artwork. So I think just even our course does a lot to recognize people's positionality, and that our students are not the people that just enter your room or are there for an hour and then, that's their existence. We don't know, like there's nothing else that they have outside of that. And so I think giving students an opportunity to see themselves in the course. We've had so many profound moments and the kinds of things that we've learned from our students, but then also teachers like Bridget, who worked part-time at Western's in ITRC, the Instructional Technology Resource Center, what they learn when we actually introduce themselves to more original art and things like that. I think it connects to the most profound, maybe, I don't know, I can't pick, there's a million, but one of the profound moments I had when I see our collaboration come together. Serena Mendizabal tells the story or the teaching of 7 generations, which Holly depicted, and you can see outside as trees that grow from seedlings to an aging tree that provides habitat for the next generation. And then Bridget's team animated that into a beautiful video. And so in the end, you see something you've been working so hard on together as someone's voice, someone's art, and someone's animation. And it really made me think differently about how we teach or could be teaching a lot of concepts that, like the concepts themselves, we may have been teaching for a long time.
Even intergenerational learning too.
And our team is intergenerational. It's like those are the profound things where we try to embody what we're teaching in our own practice.
It's true. And then I didn't even know this about the wisdom of the universe until there was the Western News article where 2 of the students said that the quote, like, perhaps it's time to place the rights of Mother Earth ahead of the rights to Mother Earth, really inspired them. And then they planted a tree behind their residence
to solidify their friendship and their commitment to Earth.
Like, how cute, right? Like, so yeah.
And they say, I immediately knew what it meant. So you show someone art like this and a quote like that, and they say, I immediately know what they meant. And that's what they remembered 4 months after the course.
Which is pretty cool.
The art.
Yeah. So I want to take this time to, because we have till about 3 o'clock here, and I wanted to leave because I slated as 1:30 to 3:30, but I wanted to like leave some room at the end for folks to like interact and maybe share back. The folks that are here in the space, sorry for the ones online, come visit FCG sometime to maybe think of it and share on the walls. But I just want to provide an opportunity for a couple of questions if we have any. Maybe we'll take one. If there's no immediate in-person ones, then we'll maybe go online first. Are there any online? Awesome.
There's a question online. Do you identify Indigenous art in the Americas and being outside of Eurocentric art history?
Okay, wait. So do you identify Indigenous to the Americas art as outside the Eurocentric art history canon? Is that kind of what they're well, I'm like, none of us are art historians, you know. Yeah. Well, I'm actually kind of thinking about just about how our art, like Summer touched on it, and about how also Indigenous art for a long time wasn't considered art. It's considered myths or or crafts. You know, we got a beadwork artist in the audience, and I was thinking about how even the art, what producing beadwork teaches us: patience. Yeah. And it's okay to make mistakes, right? So but then that question makes me think of Kent Monkman, who literally is like, I'm going to teach people about Indigenous or Canadian history through this Indigenous lens of what has happened, how we've experienced it using European canon of those massive, huge, Romantic period style pieces. Any thoughts from the panelists?
My sister's the art historian, but yeah, I mean, I think for me, Kent Monkman came to mind as well with his influence. So I think a lot of more contemporary stuff, like we're engaged in cultural exchange all the time, right? We have like many influences, but I think like also, of course, Indigenous art has its own history and its own traditions that we can go back to.
Mm-hmm.
I, you know, I tell my students, just about every college or I tell my students just about every college, university offers art history. But we are not privileged to learn our own our own artistic traditions and our own creative history in those institutions. Like I took art history at Western, and in this beautiful textbook of the canon of Western art, there was like a very thin chapter on Indigenous art and artists. And I think, again, when I think about what goes into creating art from a capitalist colonial society, is art for consumption. When we're talking about Indigenous art, there's a whole history of how we got to where we are today with our art. We're not a culture under glass. We're always evolving. We're always transforming. We're always engaging in cultural exchange. But I privilege Indigenous art because it's something that when we go out into other institutions and other places, we're not privileged to celebrate our own achievements. And so I do that with my students.
Mhm. I hope that answers your question. Do we have any questions in person? Yeah, Bev.
Storytelling of group model integration. And I'm ready to read, but we are coming across big technological time we've never been in before in our history. And how is that going to play out from you as teachers, and how do we transfer? What is the internet? Is it colonial, or is it, what is that? The East, I don't know what to call it. I have two names, but it would be appropriate, but yeah. But that's, I just wonder how that plays out with this whole picture. It really is in our face everywhere we go.
A great question. So yeah. So to repeat the question for folks who might not have heard, Bev is asking about the role of technology and how it's impacted the way Indigenous folks tell stories, or might impact, or how it impacts our teaching as well, especially thinking about storytelling and the oral tradition, and how we pass things down orally, and then how the internet and other technology plays a role in this. Is that a good summary?
Well,
Yeah.
just a footnote, I think what you're doing is Daniel.
Well, it's fraught with complexity, I think.
I'm thinking about with our course. So one of the first things we were doing is we were actually making a course that other instructors could use in their own disciplines in their own institutions, but then they would be located on different lands. So I'm really like taking from what I learned from you. But one of the things that we had people do is just recognize that the teachings that were included in our course are focused on the lands that we're on here. And that if they wanted to take some of that structure, then they should be engaging with people local to where they are. So I think that's not the answer to your question, but it's how we've tried to be thoughtful about how, yeah, the internet is a beast and your stuff can go really broadly, but are the teachings here the ones that you want to be sharing the most of, or do you want to be thinking about the lands where you're at and making sure you talk to people where you are as well?
I think it made me think about like the learning bundle project
Yeah,
that we were both
too.
involved in. So I did a bundle before I left Western on Indigenous women's resilience. And after I left, I heard, oh, it's a really popular bundle. And I mean, I feel like this is kind of like this legacy that I'm leaving behind at Western, right? I think that as Indigenous people, we do a really good job of making use of digital technology. I mean, even before digital, like we have wax recordings of like our stories and songs and stuff that we can go back to. So I think we have been using it as a really good way to like reach more people. And yeah, like also just, I mean, there's a Western idea of the archive, but like archiving this information that could be lost, right?
And even like thinking too, like about folks and your comments on Duncan Campbell Scott and like the disappearing Indian, and thinking about like Edward S. Curtis and how he was a photographer who traveled around North America taking photos of the dying Indians, the last Indians. But it wasn't necessarily archival because none of those photos have the stories of the people attached to them. They don't have the names. And Paul C. Squassis, I don't know I forget where he's from, but he's from a First Nation in Canada, has been doing this online project for a long time, going through Canadian archives to find all these old photos that were taken of Indigenous people, matching them to and helping the communities and find the stories that belong with them. So I think then on the flip side, when you have Indigenous folks who take these tools and use them to record our stories, we're like thinking about those things. It's like, I want to know if I, took a photo of a dancer at a powwow, I want to be able to say, this is who this person is, and not just like put it in a thing and be like, Indigenous woman dancing, like with no context or anything like that. And so that's the thing about the internet, is that and why a lot of folks don't want things recorded or don't want things shared on there, is because they quickly get taken out of context. So our Learning Bundles project is a curriculum resource at Western. It's a collaborative project where we have like a lead. So like Jennifer was the lead on the women's resilience, and also some like visits with knowledge keepers and folks that can add to that. But we don't have it just publicly available, because the minute it goes out there is the minute that people can interpret it, reinterpret it, and we lose that context and we lose that relationship to each other, to land. And so the internet has this weird thing, but I'm thinking of Danica Pollock Potts' work in like data sovereignty and digital place, and like there are Indigenous folks that are like writing about this and thinking about this. Jennifer Wemigwan's digital bundle, but I do think too, also to think about it as well, is this is popping into my head now as well from another conference I was at, where someone said, we're storing all this information in these massive like these rooms, servers that require a lot of energy and materials that are extracted from the land to host all this information, and to and like they're in places where it's like, requires a lot of air conditioning because it gets so hot. And so also having the internet and having technology and these places to store these things can also be a violent thing for Indigenous lands and people. So there's like a lot. There's like, your question is huge, Bev. Yeah, and it's like I'm like, that should be the next another panel topic in the future. Did you have any thoughts, Summer, you wanted to offer?
I think, again, there's a lot of learning that I've done over the past few years, making the switch from in classroom to online. And what became really apparent during the pandemic for me, and teaching online, was the issue of even access to the internet. So, if we just think about, who is privileged to have access to the internet, who has more than one device in their household. I had students who were parents who were sharing devices with their children, and on our First Nations communities, we don't have a lot of, we don't have reliable internet all the time. Sometimes we're in like the dead zone, and not all of the information is coming to our devices. Some people are using their phones, some people are using tablets. And so standardizing online learning when we're dealing with issues like digital inequity in our communities. I had a student who, I'm thinking about, was during the pandemic at the height, in like a Tim Hortons parking lot, accessing Wi-Fi to attend class. So when I'm thinking about how do we even engage with the internet and online learning, I just also have to really, consider that there's a lot of digital inequity that our students and our learners are facing, and even having access. So places like Indigenous services, you know, where there are access to, you know, computers and laptops and technology and that sort of thing. I think, you know, trying to wrap your head around, okay, what did the students actually need to learn in order to succeed? And so, you know, I consider that, because one of the stories that I tell is a personal story about my own learning journey, where I was in my master's year at Western, and it was 2013, and I had purchased my first laptop. Like, it wasn't until 2013 that I actually had my own laptop, you know, and I was going to school at that time, pulling all-nighters in my office on the res, because there was a computer there that had reliable internet. So yeah, there's a lot of issues, and it's really complex around the internet and learning, and not just the information that comes down to us, but also who has access to that information.
Access to is something I think about a lot, because it's like, on one hand, the internet can provide access. If you have access to the internet can connect us to elders and storytellers in different communities and language speakers. I, you know, during the pandemic, saw this huge increase in language being available online, but also, yeah, who can access it? Or, you know, working at a university and creating learning resources that are available, yes, to the university students, but thinking about how they pay to access the knowledge that we're sharing. Like, we're not getting them to pay for bundles, but they pay tuition, right? And our practice is to share knowledge willingly and freely, and because it's important. And so then just like thinking about all kinds of things in that regard. It's a big one. Thank you much for your question, Bev.
So I'm just curious about something. I noticed like a trend in paper and like I always find that all art. And so it only makes sense that maybe like but I wonder, like, US teachers, how do you view when Indigenous issues come into the classroom? Like, not even like, I'm thinking of like this difference where it's like they're telling the story of like the wealthy and that were murdered by the town. And so while an important story, I then started thinking, well, this is going to be a non-Indigenous director getting a lot of praise and adding value to his name. And, you know, and so what happens to these Indigenous people who still live in those lands and still carry like it's a good and a bad, right? And so like, yeah, the same with the internet, but the more that people learn, the more they want to. But how, like, is that something that you can even cover in your class of, like, how do you remain mindful while decolonizing?
Wait, what is that sign? Repeat. Okay. I was just like, are you telling me to wrap it up? I'm like, I'll tell you when we wrap it up. Okay. So, okay, let me try and do this. Just, I should have walked over there and given you my mic. Okay. So the question is, when it comes to Indigenous stories, I guess almost like hitting pop culture, but also mainstream through things like, you know, directors like Martin Scorsese in that new movie, Killers of the Flower Moon, where this is a group of people's history and their lived experiences and the intergenerational trauma they're still living with, but it's still a Scorsese film, and kind of like trying to nuance, like, what does that mean for, like, what is the role of non-Indigenous, maybe what the question is, what is the role of non-Indigenous people in telling these, or like,
Yeah, like, I just would like to hear thoughts, because I see the good and bad of it, because
Yeah.
they use Indigenous actors, so now, like, the artist Jay Oakmont has work on the cover of British Vogue.
yes.
So it's
Yeah.
like amplifying them, but it's still rooted in like a colonial setting, right? Because it's not us telling our own stories and getting all this recognition.
Mhm.
We're still just the like tool used for recognition.
Yeah.
And I guess, like, I don't know, I guess it's so complicated, but
It
it doesn't I've been
is. What are you guys thinking?
I mean, I haven't seen the film yet myself, so I can't speak directly to that, but I think a lot about like this kind of general idea. And I mean, especially in like storytelling and philosophy. Like I always say, like, who can do Indigenous philosophy? Indigenous people only, right? And I think like non-Indigenous people and settlers can learn from Indigenous storytelling and Indigenous philosophy. But I think in retelling those stories or like depicting them in film or whatever medium, I think that Indigenous people should be like taking the lead on that, rather than, like you're saying, like Martin Scorsese is getting like all this praise for that, right? And I think of another example, Antlers, which I don't know if it got that much attention, but they kind of threw in like the token Indigenous person with Graham Greene in it. It's like there's the Indigenous stamp of approval, and then it's like the monster, I won't say its name, was affecting only like white people in this town, right? And it's like they just go to Graham Greene as like the elder to tell them what's going on and how to fix the problem. But then it's just like, yeah, it's settlers engaging with this like Indigenous story. So I think it's complicated, but in my opinion, like, I think you should just, like, the very basic thing is like Indigenous people should be telling these stories.
I think, one of the beautiful ways that we are telling stories in and participating in popular culture is through shows like Reservation Dogs. And I absolutely love Reservation Dogs because it's telling the story of the experiences of Indigenous youth in their home community, but it's also, written, directed, produced. All of the technical people who are a part of this production are all Indigenous, and it's garnered like a lot of attention from both the Indigenous community and non-Indigenous community, because again, like, we're always, we internalize these messages about us and our stories and where they belong, who has access. But a show like Reservation Dogs, for me, is really beautiful because it's participating in popular culture, and it's showing, the beauty, the truth, the sad things, the really happy things about Indigenous experiences. But what I really enjoy about that particular show is that from beginning to end, the production is entirely Indigenous people. And also Taika Waititi is part of it. And I love Taika Waititi.
And can I just add to that? I mean, we also have like Imaginative coming up next month, right? So I think we've reached the point where we don't need anyone else telling our stories, right? We have like the means and people to do it ourselves. And it's the same thing in the academies. It's like we're all teachers, right? That Indigenous people can be in the academy teaching this. We don't need people doing it for us, right? Like, yeah, we can engage together and like do it together. But yeah, we don't need like Martin Scorsese taking the lead, right?
Yeah. Are you adding or are you asking a question? Okay. Great.
I think like, for the most part, but not like completely there, but like, I think for the most part, you can't hear me, I'm pretty loud. I think like Hollywood has done a lot better of a job.
They want them to have it.
You really want?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
People online.
Okay. I'm gonna reference a couple shows that I really like. So I like zombie shows and stuff. So Fear the Walking Dead season 3. It's like a spinoff of The Walking Dead. It was like the whole premise of that whole season was a conflict between these non-indigenous group and then a group of natives, and it was all about land and resources and everything that's very reflective of real life stuff. But then you throw in zombies. And so whenever I see like indigenous communities and stuff, like I always like Google it after to make sure like they went about it the right way. Like, I don't know what I would do, like if like they didn't like send a mean tweet or something, but I would look and make sure that like these shows and these things are doing the right thing. And they did. They consulted with like a lot of the local indigenous communities and all the people that were on set, and they hired all indigenous actors and everything like that. Like, wasn't like a Mexican and pretending to be a native or anything like that. It was like legit native people, and it was amazing. It was a really, really good season. And kind of just going like, I just think that they are starting to do a lot better job of portraying us, and not just like that stereotypical long-haired native on a horse, bare chest, like that old, like that's so old, that timeless Indian you guys were talking about. And then last year, the Last of Us came out, and that's like another zombie show. And then they're walking through the woods and they run into Graham Greene. Oh my God. And that scene though, it is so real, right? Like it's just like a grandma and a grandpa, and like the older, and they made him soup and stuff. And it's just like, it was so good. It was so good. And anyways, I just think about like old shows like Major League, all the stereotypical Cleveland Indian stuff and everything in there. But I just think it's getting a lot better. It's definitely not where it should be, but I think it's getting better. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's like goes back to reciprocity too. Like, I think it's really hard because as much as we want to decolonize the world and we want to like, do things differently, the film industry is out there to make money. So it also, I am apprehensive at times too, even though doing all of the things the right way, consulting, how are the communities benefiting, not just from, oh, you get to have your story told, like, financially, if this is a big blockbuster movie, how is that giving back to the communities? How is that making space go? Is it going into a fund so that, there's a scholarship for Indigenous filmmakers or something like that, right? So I think that this work can be done, like, I think collaboration is really important, but also if you have resources to create a film or to create, all these things, because you've made all of this money, like you're Martin Scorsese, and you have this, that, thinking about how to be like, I have all these resources, I have all these connections, you have a story, how can I help you tell it? And that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of like learning and unlearning happening, like you said, Mike, and trying to do things differently. And I don't know quite like what the answer is, but I do think we're going in somewhat of a good direction there and seeing more representation. For sure, that does mean a lot, because even that scene in Last of Us, it made my day. Like I was like, there's somebody, like they like, that's like, those are like, that's an auntie and an uncle right there. Like, grandma cook them and mush them. So yeah, and it was something I didn't expect. And that's the other thing too, is like we if we say like leave us out of it, then we don't get to see ourselves in it. And then that's also risky too, because it's kind of nice to just see Indigenous people in a film, yes, being Indigenous, but that's not like I don't know, like the point of it or something. Like, this is not related, but kind of related, but I was watching a show the other day where there was like a character that was just like pregnant, but like that wasn't like part of the plot line. She was just pregnant and existing in the show. And that's kind of where I'm thinking of like Graham Greene in that scene. It's like, they just happen to be Indigenous, like, and they were like thriving in this post-apocalyptic world, but that wasn't like the point of it. It wasn't like trying to be like, oh, they're like, that kind of thing, if that makes any sense. But yeah. Good question. You got. So I feel like we should probably wrap up because folks are probably winding off online and but in listening to this conversation, and we touched on so many different things that it's just like I hope that folks can see how interconnected, but also like how complex a lot of these topics are and navigating this things like an ethical space where we have folks from different perspectives coming together and like trying to figure out what is right, what is wrong, is there a totally right this way, is there a totally wrong, what is that gray area, but also that there's so many things to think about, like land and future generations and reciprocity and like all of these different topics. And so as we wrap this up, I guess I want to invite you folks, like if you have any, like, do you have any last words you would like to say, or you want me to just wrap it up? Yeah. Okay. So um I guess what I'm trying to say is that I feel like this is just like this exhibit, that this is just this topic is just introducing this conversation, because I hope that you can go away and keep having these conversations. And if there's something that you heard today that stood out to you, that you go home and you research it, or you look it up, or you talk to your friend about it, and you keep having these conversations, because we learn, like Summer said, when we are vulnerable with each other, but also through visiting with one another and through sitting together and just like talking things through. So many people are like, how do I do decolonizing? How do I do indigenizing? And I'm like, honestly, so much of it is just like sitting and listening, and then also just visiting and talking, because that's, this stuff isn't written down. It's not like, we didn't write a paper about this. Let's do that. No, I'm kidding. I'm absolutely kidding. Absolutely want to do that. But those kinds of things. And then also invite folks to come back and hear some of the other conversations that are part of this series. So next Tuesday, we're going to watch Real Indian together, which is a bit of, it's an older documentary, but, I was like, how could I forget the director's name? It's Neil Diamond, but it's not the Neil Diamond. It's Neil Diamond, where, a lot of learning for me about how mainstream non-Indigenous media has shaped even how, like, myself as an Indigenous person, like, as a kid growing up was like, didn't want to be like, I'm Anishinaabe, because like other kids and even myself were like, I don't look like what is being like portrayed in Pocahontas or in Looney Tunes or any of these like kinds of things. And so we'll watch that together. And then myself and Sally Kiwayosh, who is a faculty member in information and media studies at Western, and a member of Walpole Island Bukajwanok. We're going to talk about this, like, not just what do you expect the Indigenous perspective to do for you, but how are perspectives of Indigenous people shaped by different media, such as news and entertainment media, but then also how to work with Indigenous stories in an ethical way. And if you are non-Indigenous and you want to tell an Indigenous story, like, what do you have to, like, what can you do? 'Cause Sally also teaches on those topics. And then if you really liked hearing from Mike Sywink there, he will be a panelist on October 3rd. He is a muralist. It pains me to speak well of him. No, I'm kidding. But he's a muralist who has been getting a lot of recognition for his work towards indigenizing spaces through his artwork. And then my colleagues, Paula Hedgepeth Cornelius, who led the creation of the Wampum Learning Lodge through community consultation, so an Indigenous place here in London, Ontario, that is imbued with Indigenous culture and stories and community input about what should be in there. And then Laura Ramirez, another colleague of mine who works with plants and seeds and will talk about indigenizing place by restoring native species and like literally thinking about Indigenous place, like, the things that grow. And then on the 5th, I know there's so much, holy. And then on the 5th, Leith Makwa, who's an amazing beadwork artist, will be speaking as part of Western Visual Arts Art Lab series. So that's on October 5th, and she'll be speaking about her art beadwork practice and her sharing some of her story. That, and then there's a bajillion other things going on for Truth and Reconciliation this month. But please check out Forest City Gallery's website for more information about the Towards Breeding events, and then also Indigenous initiatives at Western. You can catch a whole bunch of Western related Truth and Reconciliation stuff there. So had to plug all the things. I know that was long. I'm sorry. I saw a summer tune out there, but that's okay. But Chimiigwacho everyone for coming today. Please save those questions, Josh, because they might inform another panel. And if you have questions or thoughts that even if you don't think that they fit here, please contribute them to the walls, because the whole point of having this space like this is to bring community together in thinking about these complex topics and ideas about working towards indigenizing or working towards decolonizing. So much for coming, everyone. I want to be like, because of those protests earlier, I want to be like, go raise hell. No. But yeah, have a great day and stay tuned.